The major way that individuals, the number one way that individuals can influence like government is through like voting. So obviously, one of the things that has happened in the course of American history is that as we've gone through history, more and more people have won the right to vote. I mean, initially, you're talking about just white male property owners, and then gradually, as we've gone through, amendments and laws have really opened up the voting process to allow a greater percentage of the American public to sort of like participate. So this video is going to focus on a couple of key amendments and laws that just deal with the issue of voting. So these are the amendments first. And a lot of these we've talked about at other points of the year. 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870, is significant because it gave African American males the right to vote. This is one of the post like sort of Civil War amendments, and unfortunately, really the impact of this law was muted by the fact that many of the Southern legislatures came up with ways to sort of like prevent African American males from voting even after the passage of the 15th Amendment, whether it was through literacy tests or poll taxes or grandfather clauses or any of the things that you probably would have talked about in one of your American history classes previously. They were sort of like underhanded attempts to sort of like limit the impact of the 15th Amendment. The 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920, gave women the right to vote. So obviously, this is deep into American history by this point, but women finally gained suffrage rights in 1920 through the 19th Amendment. The 23rd Amendment also deals with voting. This is passed in 1961. It's really not until 1961 that Washington, D.C. has the ability to vote in presidential elections. If you lived in Washington, D.C. pre 1961, like you couldn't vote in presidential elections because like D.C. is not part of a state and only states have electoral votes. So finally, in 1961, members or citizens of DC are given the ability to vote in a presidential election, and Washington DC is given a separate 3 electoral votes. Still today, members of Washington DC, members, I keep saying members, citizens of DC, if you live in DC, like you don't have anybody in Congress, you have no congressional representation because you're not part of the state. That's why DC's license plates say no taxation without representation because they're not represented. 24th Amendment is ratified in 1964, and this eliminates the poll tax. One of the things that Southern states put into effect to sort of like limit the voting power of African Americans post 15th Amendment. Having to pay to vote was eliminated by the 24th Amendment. And then the 26th Amendment is ratified in 1971, and this drops the minimum voting age to 18. It was previously 21, but if you look at the time period, 1971, if you know your American history, this is following the Vietnam War. And the argument that, at 18, you were deemed mature enough to go off and fight for your country and potentially die, but you couldn't vote for the people that sent you there. So it made sense post Vietnam War to drop that minimum voting age from 21 to like 18. And some of the laws that you're required to know that deal with voting, 1965, one of the most monumental sort of like laws ever passed in our country, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This is the height of the civil rights movement. If you ever saw the movie Selma, Dr. King's like infamous march to put pressure on, in that case, it was the government of Alabama, but really on the national government to sort of allow African Americans to vote like they should have. And though we talked about the elimination of the poll tax through an amendment, that only dealt with the poll tax. There were lots of other mechanisms that were still used, such as like literacy tests and grandfather clauses and those types of things. Literacy tests being like you have to either pass a history test or you can be able to demonstrate the ability to read to vote. Like all of those additional barriers were eliminated by the 65 Voting Rights Act. And we already talked about this previously in one of our mandatory court cases. But the 65 Civil Rights Act also mandated pre-clearance. So all the areas in the red that had a history of discriminating against African American voters, like they did something in the past that essentially tried to discriminate against African American voters, they were put on this like naughty list, for lack of a better way of putting it. And this established the fact that if any of these communities in the future were going to make changes to their voting, they would have to get it approved by the Department of Justice first to get cleared to make sure that it was being done for good reasons and not for like racially discriminatory reasons. This was in 1965, and it existed all the way up until 2013, where this was essentially ended by the Supreme Court case of Shelby County v. Holder. So there is no more pre-clearance today. This ended that part of the 1965 the Voting Rights Act. Ginsburg was one of the major critics of the Supreme Court's majority decision in this case. She basically said that it's worked, right? And you don't throw out like your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Like you're not getting wet because of the umbrella. And her argument is like that's why there hasn't been discrimination, is because of this law. Not that it should be done away with because there is no discrimination today. The National Voter Registration Act was passed in 1993, and the intention of this is to sort of like get more people registered to vote. It just allows individuals to register to vote when you renew your driver's license. So if you renew your driver's license, you have to do it periodically. It'll ask you if you're not registered to vote, do you want to vote there or register to vote there? Or if you have to go to a government office to apply for like food stamps or another government service, they might ask you at that point, do you want to sort of also register to vote? So it's also referred to as the Motor Voter Act because, again, when you renew your driver's license, it just provides you with the opportunity. Hey, while you're there, do you want to register to vote? And this has been shown to sort of like increase registered voters. And then in 2002, it should be Help America Vote Act, which basically gives funding to counties across the country to modernize their voting machines. Again, one of the things that you might not know is that every county and local government is really responsible for administering their own elections, including purchasing voting machines for their citizens to use. It's not like a national thing. We don't all vote on the same voting machines. And like we live in Montgomery County, which is a pretty affluent county, and we vote on pretty good machines, but uh, less affluent communities are voting on like maybe voting machines in Montgomery County used like decades ago, right? Like leftover machines. And this was meant to give federal funding to some of these more impoverished, especially rural communities, sort of like modernize how they were voting. And this comes out of the 2000 election controversy, in which, especially in Florida, there were ballots in which, like you can see, essentially used like a little pin and or a pen almost, and you would punch holes next to the president candidate you wanted to win, instead of like an automated sort of like system. And this ballot was a little problematic because people were reading it top down on the left hand side, and they just hit the second button if they wanted to vote Democrat off this ballot. But because they saw like 1-2, 1-2, but what they didn't see is that they would actually be voting for the third party candidate here, the Reform Party candidate, Pat Buchanan. And then if you wanted to vote Democrat, it's actually the third button down. And this caused a bunch of people to cast ballots in a way that they didn't want to cast them. And this act was intended to sort of like modernize the voting procedures and allow a greater standardization amongst how people voted across the country.